explosion of gold to fill the cracks. Chapter 6. What's Revenge to Fear? Summary for this chapter. Katsuki has reached the hospital. He just wants to move on with his life and get some sleep. The hospital was loud. Katsuki brought up his shaking hands to cover his ears, trying to block out the rush of people going by and all the people talking to All Might. The pro-hero walked through all of them, saying something, guarding him from the outside world with his strong, all-encompassing static. All Might adjusted his hold on him and gently set Katsuki down on something soft that easily sank underneath him. A bed, he realized, with a pillow under his head. He didn't remove his hands from his ears, blocking out the people who were trying to get his attention. The static faded and disappeared. All Might hadn't stuck around. Katsuki briefly wondered why he'd never noticed the static of his teacher before, but his brain was tired, even as Aizawa's caffeine left him wired. He just wanted to be left alone to sleep. A hand touched his arm, breaking through the fog. "Bakugo, please let us help you." "Recovery girl." Katsuki let his hands relax, willing to listen. Her voice was gentle and familiar, comforting in this uneasy situation. "You can hear me, that's good. It's Recovery girl here," she softly introduced herself. "I'm here to help out, but you're going to have to work with us. We're going to do some tests to see where you're at. We'll put in an IV and clean you up. A male nurse is here to help you with that part, all right?" Katsuki hesitantly nodded. This wasn't like fixing up the damage after a practical lesson in hero class. A pit started forming in his stomach. This wasn't something he could brush off with a rest day and go straight back to full strength in the next class. "The eyes are a tricky part of the body, and I can't quite tell the extent of the damage without those burns. That will come last, after we clean up everything. Do you understand all of that, Bakugo?" It struck him how soft her tone was, handling him as if he was a fragile vase. Katsuki couldn't argue. It was good, even if it was weird. He nodded. "Good. Your parents are being contacted, so I'll leave you for now." Katsuki didn't notice anyone else beside the bed until they spoke. "Hey there, Bakugo. I'm the nurse who's going to help you get settled." The door closed and curtains were pulled closed, giving him some semblance of privacy. Katsuki didn't see much point in it. A stranger was stripping him down nude and cleaning him up with a wet sponge because he was drop-dead tired and couldn't see well enough to do it himself. Didn't feel much like privacy. The remnants of nitroglycerin, sweat, puke, urine, and blood were finally wiped away. He would have liked a deeper scrub and a long soak in a bath, but that could wait until he was home. "Hey." Katsuki felt obligated to tell the guy about his quirk, although his throat still cracked. There was technically an official record somewhere, but he was pretty sure those had become confidential as soon as he entered UA. He forced out, "My sweat is flammable." "Biohazardous quirk, huh? I'll make a note of that. Know what it's made up of?" "Nitroglycerin. Sorta." "Handle you with gloves, got it. You know, we actually give that in pill form to some patients with heart conditions. I heard you're attending UA. It sounds like a pretty fierce quirk for a hero. Am I right in guessing you inhale a lot of that nitroglycerin?" Katsuki nodded. "Have you been using your quirk lately?" He shook his head. Too dangerous to set off explosions in his tied-up position. "I think you'll be fine, but you might benefit from a supplement while you're not using it. I'll get that for you in a bit." The small talk ended there. The nurse commented on the rash going down his legs, but didn't touch it too much to Katsuki's relief. He could handle that himself with the burn cream he had at home. The nurse was probably adding it to some clipboard he couldn't see anyway. His face was cleaned last. Katsuki sat on the edge of the bed in cold hospital clothes as his face was dabbed at with cotton balls soaked in alcohol or something. There was a knock at the door, which gave him the opportunity to lean away with a sigh. He was given a rest as the nurse answered it. "Hi, I was told Bakugo Katsuki was in this room. I'm one of his teachers at UA High. I'm sure he'll appreciate the company. Bakugo, do you mind a visitor?" Katsuki was silent, waiting for Aizawa to just come in already. "He's been pretty quiet since he came in," the nurse said. His words not nearly as cheerful as the voice he put on for tending to Katsuki. The nurse and Aizawa must have exchanged looks or something, since Aizawa came in, and Katsuki heard what sounded like a chair pulled over the floor closer to the bed. The door closed, and the nurse returned to work on his face. Instead of the same alcohol stuff, he lightly smeared something cool and soft on the skin around his eyes and nose. Katsuki experimentally blinked and grimaced when his eyes stung. He reached up to his face. "No, don't touch." The nurse stopped his hands and switched to dabbing his eyes with a dry cloth. "Recovery girl is going to be a big help here. She came right over as soon as she heard a UA student was en route. She's the nurse at your school, right? Her quirk is really something." Katsuki's mouth worked. "Aizawa, why not UA?" "Why not bring you to UA?" Aizawa repeated in more words, picking up on his question. "Well, for one, school's out for the summer," he explained, his dry voice steady. "And two, this hospital was closer to that place we found you. Do you know where you were?" Katsuki opened his mouth, then closed it and shook his head, being careful not to disturb the nurse's work. "Well, it's a little ways away from UA. Last anyone reported seeing you was on a bus after classes let out on Friday. Where were you headed?" This was turning into an official questioning. "Home." "Right. Bakugo, that was in the opposite direction of where we found you." So that throwaway villain had dragged him somewhere in the middle of nowhere. No surprise there. Katsuki knew it hadn't been that close to the shore, at the very least. Even from his house, Katsuki was used to the squawk of seagulls. The beach barely had the dignity to be called a beach, but it was still within walking distance. That dungeon place had been more inland, with no seagulls and no smell of the sea or crash of the waves. No cars rushing by, just crickets at night. An achingly lonely place. Aizawa didn't wait for his reply. Not that he had one for the hero teacher. "Can you recall what the villain looked like?" Katsuki shook his head. The cretin had knocked him out from afar, and then he'd blown up his own face before he had a chance to look at him. He hadn't thought it very important. That makes the police's work more difficult, if they don't even have a description to go off of. "How did they capture you?" Katsuki took a deep breath. In that moment, he appreciated Aizawa's approach of not beating around the bush. "One guy," he started, "drank to neck." He heard Aizawa shift on the chair. "Knocked out, then the villain transported you to that basement. I see. As your teacher, I'll relate this to the police with your permission." Katsuki nodded. "I have a feeling you don't really want to talk much about it anytime soon," Aizawa surmised. "As your teacher, I care about you, Bakugo. What happened to your eyes?" Katsuki tensed, scowling. Yeah, straight to the point." "Explosion," he said, clipping the answer with his frustration at himself. "Yours or the villain's?" "Mine." A knock came from the door. "Right, I think my work here is done," the nurse said. Katsuki heard him fumbling with the cleaning tools. "You can sit back, and I'll see who that is." Katsuki felt around the bed and soon found the sheet, pulling it up to cover his exposed legs. He settled back while another nurse brought in the IV that recovery girl had mentioned, along with... "And here's a bottle of green tea for your throat, as well as a nutrition shake," the nurse explained. Katsuki shuddered. He waited with dread as the nurse jabbed his arm with a needle. He felt uncomfortable and weirded out that he couldn't see it, but he could live with that. He waited for one of the bottles to be brought to his mouth, but instead the nurse put it in his hand, helping him grip it. "There's a straw, so it should be easier to handle." A straw. Katsuki felt around the lip of the bottle and found the little plastic straw sticking out of it. In something like disbelief, he took a cautious sip. The green tea was lukewarm, lightly sweetened, but it was something for his dry throat that washed away the lingering tastes of bitter tannin and old blood. "All right, if you're comfortable, I'll let you rest," the nurse explained. "Another doctor will come by to take a look at you in a bit, but in the meantime, just rest. Your teacher will keep you company, and if you need anything, there's a button on the side of the bed you can press." Katsuki nodded and kept sipping the tea. "The shake is on the table to the right of you. Try to drink as much as you can. You need the nutrients right now." A beat. He didn't like the nurse just standing around there. "All right, I'll leave him to you." That part was aimed at Aizawa, he assumed. Katsuki blinked slowly, making a face at the stinging pain left over from whatever the nurse had been putting on his eyes. The door closed, and Katsuki assumed the nurses were gone. Just him and Aizawa left. He rubbed his eye to spite that other nurse. He refused to admit that it made his face hurt like a bitch. He sighed and leaned back a bit more on the angled hospital bed, trying not to twitch at all the pain that had spiked to the surface. Having let go of the straw for a moment, he blindly searched for it with his mouth. Before he could get it back in his mouth, the bottle was pulled out of his hand. "I was drinking that." "I could see that. A little too fast there," Aizawa pointed out. The bottle tapped a solid surface, and the straw knocked against the edge of the bottle. What are you doing? Hey. Katsuki stopped as something else was knocked against his knuckles. He hesitated for a second too long before he grabbed the bottle. A different shape, but it also had a straw. The nutrition shake, he gathered, but even that logical deduction didn't stop him from hesitating as he stuck the straw in his mouth. All Might brought you here instead of the emergency room because it's not as loud, and you might feel less rushed. It also keeps you out of the spotlight for now. The media would have a field day if they found out a UA student was in the hospital. Katsuki hadn't asked, but okay. He sucked at the straw. The shake was thicker than the tea, and the flavor was more like a failed attempt at chocolate. Not puke-worthy and actually soothingly cold, so he kept drinking. Not that your condition isn't concerning, but given how we found you, you made the right decision. Midoriya is probably speaking to police at the moment. Katsuki still couldn't believe it had been Izuku who had ultimately found him. He said he found my backpack nearby. Did he? He sent his location to a number of your classmates, saying that he found you and needed backup. Todoroki and Ida were the ones to forward the message straight to me. He went in on his own, but fortunately, the villain who kidnapped you wasn't around. Fortunately? Katsuki imagined that Izuku's ridiculous quirk would have easily taken out that 2-bit villain, but he didn't know how the webbing worked, and if Izuku had been shot with that stinger, that put him on a cooldown until he dropped, to be tied up just like him. Aizawa grabbed the bottle he was holding, forcing his hands to stop shaking. Hey, you're in the hospital now. Aizawa's voice was soft. You're not there anymore, and you don't have to face that villain again. In fact, you're banned from ever going after him. Katsuki froze. No thoughts of revenge allowed here. Was that how his teacher thought of him? Someone who would go after revenge? Katsuki felt small, helpless. If there was anything he wanted, it was to never see or think about that villain ever again. No, he croaked, and he pulled his knees to his chest, feeling like he was alone in this vast, dark void. He knew Aizawa was right next to the bed, but he couldn't see anyone else. Zuzu could have been caught, too. The nickname slipped out again. Somehow, he didn't want to say Deku, but saying his proper name just felt too weird and formal. Aizawa breathed in a sharp gasp. So this was why Aizawa was being so vague about where he'd been tied up. The heavy weight filled up his stomach, and he didn't feel like drinking the shake anymore. Untrustworthy was what he was, apparently. So hot-headed that he'd run at the first chance to get back at the villain without realizing what an utterly stupid waste of time that was. Never want to see that fucker again, Katsuki said, his voice gaining strength. He ignored the growing pit in his stomach, taking another sip to try to cover it up. His left arm still shook as he held the straw. He had wanted to get in a good punch at the beginning, when he realized how he'd been tricked and tied up, but he'd come to know that it was just the initial anger. Dislocated, Aizawa muttered. What? Your left shoulder. It's partially dislocated, he explained. Before Katsuki could make a jab at the subject change, he said, I'm sorry. Katsuki raised an eyebrow, his stomach flipped, and he coughed. You reminded me of another student of mine. He went looking for revenge, but I didn't catch it in time. He almost got himself killed chasing a villain, and I couldn't help but see the same happening with you, Aizawa sighed. I wouldn't forgive myself if one of my students ended up dead because of something like a grudge. The pit in his stomach lurched, and Katsuki puked over the side of the hospital bed. Aizawa sighed. That's what you get for drinking too fast. Katsuki groaned, slumping his head over the bed rail. Fuck off, Mr. Feelings. End of Chapter 6.